The copper tang of fresh blood always meant someone was dying upstairs. But today, it meant her secret was running out of time. Tessa dug her cracked knuckles into the damp stone. Lye soap gnawed at her open blisters, yet she dragged the bristles harder against the grout. She had to erase the crimson stain before Cale's patrol circled back. Acidic pain burned through her shoulders with every frantic scrub. Keep your head down. Survive the shift. Being a ghost was the only way an Omega stayed alive in this slaughterhouse. She dragged a filthy sleeve across her sweating brow. Mama, the whispered word froze the blood in her veins. Her wet hands hovered over the suds. Slowly, she turned toward the narrow cavity behind the wine casks. Shh, not a peep, Leo. Remember the game. In the cramped dark, her 4-year-old clamped his dirt-smudged hands over his mouth. His eyes caught the dim candlelight, glowing with an unnatural gold. The lichen traits were surfacing. Worse, that specific shade screamed of royal lineage. If Cale saw those eyes, he would rip the boy apart. Tessa slid across the wet stone. She shoved a stolen strip of dried venison through the gap in the bricks, letting her fingertips drag against his soft cheek. I know it's dark in there, my brave boy, but you have to stay hidden. The mean wolves are hunting today. Lying to him tasted like ash. Last night, he had asked about his father again, and she had fed him the same story about a dead hero. The truth was far more dangerous. Lucian was a reckless idiot who took her in the dark, left her with a child, and got himself banished to the wastelands. That betrayal had turned her chest into an iron vault. Above them, the floorboards shrieked under the weight of marching boots. Dozens of them. Dust shook loose from the ceiling rafters, coating her eyelashes in gray powder. Then, a shrieking wail ripped through the masonry, rattling her teeth. The perimeter siren. Someone was breaching the compound. Dust settled in the blinding noise, and the iron handle on the basement door began to turn. The iron handle snapped, and the oak doors burst inward under a crush of fleeing bodies. Terrified servants spilled down the stone stairs, screaming, tripping over hems, and scratching at the walls to escape the slaughter above. "Get to the deep cellars!" An older maid snagged Tessa's collar, yanking her backward. "They breached the gates! It's a massacre up there!" Tessa wrenched her shirt free. Going into the deep cellars meant abandoning the wine casks. If the invaders torched the manor, her boy would cook inside the walls. She threw her shoulder against the tide of panicked runners, fighting her way upstream. The siren wailed above the chaotic sobbing, pressing painfully against her eardrums. A sudden draft swept down the stairwell, carrying a new scent. Tessa hit the wall. Her boots scraped to a halt. It wasn't the rotting meat or wet dog stench of Cale's pack. This smell was violently familiar. Crackling ozone, bitter pine, pure, uncut danger. The scent sank into her bones, dragging up memories she had buried in dirt 4 years ago. No, it can't be. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself against the rough stone. Her inner wolf clawed at her mind, whining in recognition. The cellar air turned thick. It pressed down on her lungs like a physical weight, rolling off the stairs in a suffocating fog of raw dominance. He was back. Lucian hadn't died in the wastelands. According to the terrified whispers of the guards, he was no longer a boy. He was the Diamond Wolf, a ruthless killer tearing through rival territories. The ozone scent burned her nostrils, now laced with the hot copper tang of fresh carnage. He was slaughtering his way through the front lines. Tessa bolted for the wine casks, ripping away the loose bricks until her fingernails bled. "Leo! Come out, baby! We have to go into the tunnels!" The boy scrambled out, coughing through a cloud of disturbed dust. She snatched his fragile body up, pressing his face tight against her neck to smother his scent. Above them, a shock wave cracked the foundation. The concussive blast blew drywall out of the vents. They had breached the grand hall, and the footsteps were heading straight for the stairs. The iron handle snapped, and the oak doors burst inward under a crush of fleeing bodies. Terrified servants spilled down the stone stairs, screaming, tripping over hems, and scratching at the walls to escape the slaughter above. "Get to the deep cellars!" An older maid snagged Tessa's collar, yanking her backward. "They breached the gates! It's a massacre up there!" Tessa wrenched her shirt free. Going into the deep cellars meant abandoning the wine casks. If the invaders torched the manor, her boy would cook inside the walls. She threw her shoulder against the tide of panicked runners, fighting her way upstream. The siren wailed above the chaotic sobbing, pressing painfully against her eardrums. A sudden draft swept down the stairwell, carrying a new scent. Tessa hit the wall. Her boots scraped to a halt. It wasn't the rotting meat or wet dog stench of Kale's pack. This smell was violently familiar. Crackling ozone, bitter pine, pure, uncut danger. The scent sank into her bones, dragging up memories she had buried in dirt 4 years ago. No, it can't be. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself against the rough stone. Her inner wolf clawed at her mind, whining in recognition. The cellar air turned thick. It pressed down on her lungs like a physical weight, rolling off the stairs in a suffocating fog of raw dominance. He was back. Lucian hadn't died in the wastelands. According to the terrified whispers of the guards, he was no longer a boy. He was the Diamond Wolf, a ruthless killer tearing through rival territories. The ozone scent burned her nostrils, now laced with the hot copper tang of fresh carnage. He was slaughtering his way through the front lines. Tessa bolted for the wine casks, ripping away the loose bricks until her fingernails bled. "Leo! Come out, baby. We have to go into the tunnels." The boy scrambled out, coughing through a cloud of disturbed dust. She snatched his fragile body up, pressing his face tight against her neck to smother his scent. Above them, a shockwave cracked the foundation. The concussive blast blew drywall out of the vents. They had breached the grand hall, and the footsteps were heading straight for the stairs. Ears ringing from the shockwave, Tessa threw herself through the false wall of the laundry room and into the pitch-black crawls. These narrow spaces were her invisible kingdom. She knew exactly which floorboards squeaked and which corners hid the deepest shadows. That knowledge was the only reason Leo was still breathing. Right now, the cramped wood felt like a coffin. She dragged herself forward on her elbows, clutching Leo against her chest. His erratic heartbeat thumped a frantic rhythm against her ribs. If they could reach the east wing, the forest would hide them. A wet tearing sound echoed through the ventilation grate directly ahead. Tessa went rigid. She slammed her palms over Leo's ears. Through the rusted slats, the pristine marble of the main hallway was painted in fresh crimson. Kael's elite soldiers, the monsters who terrorized her daily, were scattered like broken dolls. A body slammed against the drywall beside her grate. A guard. His armor was shredded down to the ribs. Choking on his own blood, the dying man let out a bubbling gasp. Then, a shadow eclipsed the overhead light. Tessa stopped breathing. Digging her fingernails into the dirt floor, she watched a pair of blood-soaked boots step into her narrow field of vision. The air inside the crawl space instantly thickened with Alpha Command, forcing her chin toward the dirt. Her Omega instincts shrieked at her to expose her throat. She bit down on her own lip until it bled, using the sharp pain to anchor her fury and fight the submission. "Where is Kale?" The voice cracked like a whip in the confined space. It was deeper, rougher, scraped entirely hollow of warmth. It was the sound of a predator completely off its leash. "He's upstairs," the bleeding guard wheezed. "Mercy, please." A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Dust motes danced in the slanting light of the grate. "I don't know the word." Bones snapped with a sickening crunch. The guard's boots slumped lifelessly against the baseboard. Tessa swallowed the metallic taste of her own blood. The reckless boy she once loved was gone, replaced by a cold-blooded executioner. If he found his hidden heir, he would eliminate her just the same. Against her chest, Leo shifted. A tiny, terrified whimper slipped from his throat. On the other side of the drywall, The blood-soaked boots stopped moving. The diamond wolf went dead still. Silence pressed against the brick walls, thick and absolute. Tessa crushed her palms over Leo's ears, desperately trying to block the sickening snap of bone echoing from the adjacent hall. Dust drifted down from the low ceiling, catching in her throat as the slow crunch of combat boots pivoted away from the grating. He was moving toward the grand staircase. He was hunting Kale. Her locked muscles finally snapped into action. "Keep moving. Stop and die." The east exit lay 50 yards ahead, a pitch-black stretch of uneven stone. She dragged herself forward on bleeding knees, ignoring the sharp rock slicing into her shins. A rattling cough punched through the quiet. Ice flooded Tessa's veins. She shoved Leo's face into her collarbone, burying his mouth in her dirty uniform. A bitter draft whistled through the iron slats ahead. Someone had breached the outer security doors, letting the freezing night air into the subterranean maze. She shoved the logistical mystery away, focusing entirely on the next 10 feet of dirt. Above them, the floorboards bowed under the force of a deafening roar. Wood splintered. It sounded like a mountain cracking apart in the dining room. She scrambled faster, ignoring the burning fire in her lungs. The boy she knew 4 years ago had vanished into the blackwood. The monster tearing through the ceiling joists was something else entirely. Her bruised knuckles hit the final wooden panel. Moonlight bled through the warped floorboards of the abandoned laundry room. Ozone burned her nostrils. Vanilla cut with dark pine and fresh, hot blood. The roaring upstairs had ceased entirely. She pushed the rotting wood an inch. A towering shadow detached itself from the far wall, reeking of lye soap and slaughter. He was waiting. Moonlight sliced through the cracked door, illuminating the dust swirling between them. Tessa scrambled backward into the dirt, shielding Leo with her torso. The slow, rhythmic crunch of boots approached the panel. He wasn't rushing. He was stalking. Wood exploded inward. Splinters rained down in the dark. Tessa curled into a tight ball around her son as a giant fist ripped the entire frame away. Ringing filled her ears. Plaster powder coated her tongue as the broken boards clattered against the stone floor. As the debris settled, she finally looked up. Lucian Blackwood filled the jagged hole. Dark blood soaked his torn shirt. He blocked the only exit, his broad shoulders eclipsing the moonlight. His eyes burned with a lethal gold. He didn't look at the bundled coat against her stomach. His gaze locked onto her face, anchoring her to the dirt. "You," the word vibrated in the brick. "Lucian." Heat radiated off his scarred skin as he stepped into the cramped tunnel. She braced for a strike. Instead, his blood-stained fingers clamped around her chin, tilting her face into the light. 4 years, he rasped. "I burned this territory down, and you were scrubbing floors." Her stomach twisted. She tried to yank her face away, but his rough grip held her locked in place. "Why didn't you run?" His voice cracked, rough and hollow. Beneath her tattered coat, Leo let out a stifled sniffle. Lucian went completely rigid. The gold in his eyes flared. He slowly lowered his gaze to the squirming bundle in her arms. Panic clawed up her throat, sharp and blinding in the cramped tunnel. She crushed the wool coat tighter against Leo, desperately trying to muffle his shifting weight. If Lucian realized Kale had a target on this child, the slaughter would never end. "It's just laundry," the lie tumbled out. Frantic and high-pitched. Lucian stared. His broad chest expanded with a slow breath. He didn't believe a single syllable. Reaching down, his giant hand seized the collar of her uniform. He ripped her out of the tunnel dirt with terrifying ease, suspending her bare feet above the floor. "Don't lie to me." His breath grazed her cheek, hot and smelling of violence. Boots hammered against the marble hallway outside. Shouts echoed off the laundry walls as Kale's remaining guards breached the outer doors. Lucian didn't flinch. He hauled her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. Tessa dug her elbows into his back, locking her arms around the squirming coat to keep Leo hidden against her chest. "Put me down!" she hissed, kicking her legs. He kicked the broken door frame completely out of the wall. Marching into the hallway, he stepped directly into the crossfire. Blood slicked the white tiles. Tessa squeezed her eyes shut as Lucian grabbed a lunging guard by the throat. Bone snapped. The sharp crack echoed over the screaming alarms. He didn't even break his stride. He carried her past the butchery, heading straight for the polished steel doors of the royal elevator. He was taking her to the penthouse. "Let me go! Cale will find us up there!" He slammed his fist against the call button. "Cale is a dead man, and you are never leaving my sight again." The metal doors slid shut with a final, echoing clang, locking her inside a steel box with a monster. Steel ground against steel, sealing the elevator car with an echoing clang. Trapped. The penthouse required a royal handprint, and Tessa was nothing but dirt under a crown. She needed to hide his scent, hide his face, hide the truth dragging her toward the gallows. Cracked knuckles white with strain, she clamped her fingers into the wool wrapped around her son. Lucian dumped her onto the sofa. Expensive cedar masked the slaughter on the floors below. He stepped backward, drawing a ragged breath. Dark crimson dripped from his knuckles, soaking immediately into the pristine rug. The hum of the elevator gears faded into silence. Tessa buried her chin against the squirming bundle. The rabbit survives the winter by freezing in the snow, not by biting the wolf. Keeping her gaze locked on her scuffed boots, she waited for the strike. Boots sank into the plush carpet. He closed the distance, dragging a suffocating aura of absolute command into her lungs. "Drop the laundry." The words vibrated in his chest, low and lethal. "No, please." Ice flooded her veins. What kind of dark currency did he trade in the Blackwood to buy this terrifying power? The blood dripping from his chin clashed violently with the familiar heat radiating from his skin. She slammed an iron door shut in her mind, locking her panic behind it. "I stayed to clean," she lied. Her voice scraped against her dry throat. "It was just a job." He leaned down. The sudden proximity choked the air out of her lungs. Lying to a predator who knew the exact taste of her skin was suicide. Heat rolled off his wet clothes, thick with violence and unspoken history. "You are a terrible liar." The whisper scraped against her ear, holding a dark promise. The threat hung in the quiet room, sinking into the mahogany furniture. Tessa scanned the dim penthouse, mapping the locked balcony and the reinforced glass overlooking the city. 4 years of midnight shifts meant she knew every blind spot in this gilded cage. Figuring out who sold the blueprints to an invading army didn't matter right now. Surviving the next 10 feet did. Lucian stalked the perimeter of the oak doors, his scarred shoulders locked with rigid tension. Despite his restless pacing, his gold eyes stayed pinned to her shrinking frame. A sharp ache flared behind her ribs. Beneath the gore and the warlord armor, a ghost of the boy she loved flickered in the dark. She crushed the memory instantly. He was a killer, a king, a stranger holding a loaded gun to her head. Beneath the wool, Leo shifted. Tessa swallowed a gasp. A sleepy sigh broke the quiet. Boots skidded to a halt on the carpet. The air pressure snapped tight. Dust motes drifted through the slanting moonlight as the alpha tilted his chin, zeroing in on the bundle in her lap. He took a deliberate step forward. Cold stone, cellar dirt, and screaming through a bitten hand. The memory of giving birth alone flooded her nervous system. Maternal fury burned away the freezing terror. She straightened her spine, pulling her chin up. "Stay away from me." The command cut the silence, steady and sharp as glass. Lucian paused. The sudden defiance hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, caught between predatory hunger and sharp confusion. His lethal focus narrowed down to a single point. Wind rattled the reinforced glass, pulling the tension tighter. Wood splintered as boots hammered against the hallway side of the penthouse doors. Cale's surviving soldiers screamed muffled threats through the oak. Lucian didn't even turn his head toward the noise. He ignored the approaching army, keeping his gold eyes locked onto her trembling hands. A phantom ache burned against the old bite scar on her neck. Her sweating fingers slipped, just a fraction of an inch. But it was enough. The wool folded back, exposing a pale face. Leo blinked up at the shattered ceiling. In the dim light, his eyes glowed with unmistakable gold. Oxygen vanished from the room. Tessa stared at the glowing proof, waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. The secret was dead. Lucian dropped to his knees. Kneecaps hitting the floorboards with a dull thud, he sank to the carpet. Blood-stained fingers hovered in the air, shaking violently. He stared at the dark hair and the golden eyes mirroring his own face. 4 years of agonizing lies burned to ash on the sofa. He reached a shaking finger toward the boy's cheek. "You don't fight an earthquake. You just brace for the ground to swallow you whole." Tessa gripped the fabric, bracing for the slaughter. 4 years. The raw sound tore from his throat, jagged and wet. He looked up from the child, pinning her with a gaze caught between world-ending fury and absolute devastation. The fallout had finally begun. Oak splintered with a concussive crack. The heavy door bowed inward, raining jagged wood across the white rug. Tessa scrambled backward over the velvet cushions, screaming as 3 of Kale's elite soldiers breached the threshold. The putrid stench of rival alphas flooded the room, thick with rotting meat and sweat. She crushed Leo against her chest, wrapping her arms around him until her fingers went numb. A blur of dark motion intercepted the first guard. Lucian didn't just move. He collided. Muscle and bone smashed together with a force that rattled the chandelier crystals. He caught the soldier midair, twisting. Bones snapped. The sound echoed sharp and wet before the guard's boots even hit the floor. Survival instinct hijacked Tessa's brain. She threw herself over the edge of the sofa, diving behind the solid mahogany desk. She shoved Leo's face into her collarbone, burying his glowing eyes in her coat. Screams tore through the air. The wet tear of flesh and the dull thud of bodies hitting the floorboards reverberated against the desk. She squeezed her eyes shut. The screaming stopped. Hot, dark liquid dripped onto the rug beside her hiding spot. She opened her eyes. 3 broken bodies lay scattered across the pristine carpet, limbs twisted at impossible angles. Lucian stood in the center of the butchery. His broad chest expanded, dragging air into his lungs. Dark blood dripped steadily from his knuckles, pooling on the white fibers. The executioner had returned, leaving nothing but corpses in his wake. He slowly turned his head. Gold eyes pierced the shadows beneath the desk. He took a slow step forward. Blood squelched under his heavy boots. "Are you hurt?" The words scraped out of his throat, rough and entirely breathless. "No, we're fine." Her teeth chattered. Beneath her coat, Leo squirmed. The tiny boy peeked out, staring directly at the blood-soaked warlord towering over them. Lucian's knees buckled. He dropped to the ruined floor, right in the middle of the carnage. Ignoring the dead soldiers and the approaching army, he stared at the little boy. A profound, devastating heartbreak cracked his expression wide open. The city sirens wailed far below the reinforced glass, muffled and distant. Lucian stared at the boy. Slowly, a trembling, blood-stained hand reached toward Leo's face. His large fingers hovered an inch from the soft cheek. The brutal violence of the last 3 minutes clashed violently with the desperate longing shining in his eyes. Cold cellar dirt, screaming around a leather belt to muffle the sound of childbirth. Maternal fury flared hot in Tessa's chest. She violently swatted his hand away. "Don't touch him!" Lucian jerked back. The gold in his eyes ignited, burning with sudden territorial fury. "He is my blood." The low rumble vibrated in the floorboards beneath them. "You kept my son from me for 4 years." 1,000 unspoken lies crushed against her ribs. "I kept him alive," she screamed. "If Kale saw his eyes, he would have snapped his neck in his crib. Where were you when we were freezing in the dark, Lucian?" The accusation hung in the bloody air. He didn't answer. The muscle in his jaw jumped, his teeth grinding together loud enough to hear. He looked away, his broad shoulders stiffening as the guilt hit him. What happened in the Blackwood to turn him into this? The dark mystery shadowed every move he made. His anger flared, a defensive shield slamming into place. "You will never hide in the dark again." His voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "I am locking this wing down. No one comes in, no one goes out." He was treating her like property, guarding her, not trusting her. "You can't lock us in a cage just to soothe your wounded pride," Tessa argued. She stood up, shifting Leo to her hip. The overhead lights flickered violently. With a descending hum, the electrical grid completely failed. Absolute pitch black swallowed the penthouse. Tessa stopped breathing. A mechanical crackle pierced the dark. "Enjoy the dark, little brother?" Kael's slick, venomous voice echoed from the emergency intercom. "You might have raw strength, but I have the building rigged." Panic tightened like a noose around Tessa's throat. She backed away from the glass, her eyes adjusting slowly to the moonlight. The shadows had protected her for 4 years, but now they felt like a closing trap. Who gave Kael the override codes? A faint hissing sound drifted from the ceiling vents. "Wolfsbane gas," Lucian snarled. His hand clamped around her bicep. He dragged her toward the adjoining bathroom, moving blindly through the dark. "Cover the boy's face, now!" Tessa buried Leo's face against her shoulder, pulling the thick wool completely over his head. The bitter, acidic tang of aerosolized wolfsbane burned the back of her throat. It would make an Omega sick, but it would completely paralyze an Alpha. Lucian kicked the bathroom door shut. He shoved the heavy marble towel rack against the wood, dragging in a ragged breath. The poison was already working. He coughed, his massive chest heaving as the toxic air attacked his heightened senses. Kael wanted them dead. But Kael didn't know the bones of this building. Tessa did. She dropped to her knees, running her hands desperately along the cold tiles. "There's an old laundry chute behind the vanity," Tessa choked out. Her eyes watered from the fumes. "It drops straight down to the sublevels." Lucian looked down at her through the hazy air. The gold in his eyes was dimming. His terrifying strength was fading fast. But he didn't argue. He didn't try to command her. He just nodded. His raw power was useless here. She was going to have to lead the monster through the dark. Rusted metal sliced the thin cotton of her uniform, biting into her hip. Tessa braced her boots against the marble tile, shoving the vanity aside with a violent, adrenaline-fueled heave. The heavy porcelain scraped across the grout, exposing the dark square of the old laundry chute. Aerosolized wolfsbane burned the back of her throat. Acrid and bitter, the toxic fog made her eyes stream. She swung her legs into the black hole. Clutching Leo to her chest until her knuckles ached, she let go of the rim. Slick, foul-smelling sheet metal rushed past her face. The vertical drops swallowed them in a rush of cold air and terror. Her lungs burned. Her muscles screamed for oxygen. Plunging into the pitch-black sublevels felt like falling through an endless, suffocating midnight. She slammed into a pile of damp canvas bags at the bottom, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. A heavy, dead weight crashed into the canvas right beside her. "Lucian." The Alpha hit the pile with a bone-jarring thud. The concentrated poison had stripped him of his dominance. He lay tangled in the moldy bags, his broad chest heaving violently as he fought a losing battle against his own collapsing lungs. Tessa dragged her bruised body out of the pile. Her limbs shook uncontrollably from the adrenaline crash. The hum of the basement boiler echoed in the dark. He couldn't stand. The realization locked into her brain, cold and sharp as glass. The executioner was helpless, which meant the survival of her child rested entirely on her bleeding hands. A fractured memory flashed behind her eyes, a crushed bird beneath a guard's boot in the winter snow. Never again. She reached into the dark, her fingers finding the thick muscle of his forearm. "Get up." She yanked the wet fabric of his shirt. "They will track the chute. We have to keep moving." Harsh, wet breaths rattled in his throat. He dragged his back against the cold brick, using the friction to pull himself upright. The gold in his eyes flickered, dim and unstable. Yet, he pushed off the wall, yielding completely to her lead. Above them, boots hammered against the ceiling joists. Kale's hunters were tearing the penthouse floorboards apart. Tessa laced her small, dirt-stained fingers through Lucian's rough hand. Pulling him forward, she stepped into the pitch-black maze of the boiler room, dragging the broken king into the dark. Steam hissed from cracked pipes, masking the sound of their ragged breathing. Tessa moved blindly through the twisting tunnels, one hand gripping Leo, the other anchored to Lucian. 4 years of navigating these forgotten maintenance halls to steal dry bread had mapped the blind corners perfectly in her mind. She pulled them down a narrow corridor, shoving her shoulder against a heavy, lead-lined door of an old storage vault. The deadbolt clicked shut, sealing out the damp draft. Tessa slid down the concrete wall, pulling Leo into her lap. She sucked in greedy mouthfuls of stale air. Across the tiny room, Lucian collapsed onto a splintered wooden crate. His head hung between his knees, dark hair shielding his face. The poison was slowly bleeding out of his system, but the violent trembling in his shoulders gave away the physical toll. "Mama." Leo's tiny voice broke the heavy silence. He poked his head out from the folds of the wool coat. "Is the monster gone?" Lucian flinched. His head snapped up. The gold in his eyes was still dim, but the raw, human hunger shining beneath it was devastating. He stared at the child, the suffocating weight of 4 missed years, the first steps, the feverish nights, the stolen moments crashing down on his broad shoulders. Leo wiggled free from the coat. Taking a hesitant, wobbly step, the boy moved toward the blood-soaked warlord. "Leo!" "No." Tessa lunged forward. Lucian dropped to his knees on the filthy concrete. He hunched his massive frame forward, making himself as small as physically possible. Reaching into his torn pocket with a shaking hand, he pulled out a smooth, black riverstone. It was carved into the crude shape of a wolf pup. "I carved this." His voice was a ruined, gravelly rasp. "In the Blackwood. I didn't know why I was making it, but I think I made it for you." A hot tear broke free, tracking through the dirt on Tessa's cheek. He hadn't been a ghost. He had been fighting his way back through the dark the entire time, the lethal armor stripped away, leaving nothing but a desperate, shattered father kneeling in the dirt. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and completely stripped of pride. "Tessa, please let me protect him." The iron vault around her heart cracked straight down the middle. Metal screeched against metal right outside the thick door. The hunters had found the scent. Steel groaned as raw, alpha strength tore at the rusted hinges. They were trapped in a lead-lined box with 0 alternate exits. Tessa snatched Leo off the floor, crushing him against her chest as she scrambled backward into the farthest, darkest corner of the vault. Lucian forced himself up from the concrete. His legs were unsteady, the poison still burning in his veins, but he planted his boots squarely between Tessa and the buckling metal. Claws extended with a sickening snick. He squared his shoulders, preparing to buy them seconds with his own blood. The hinges snapped. The heavy vault door exploded inward. Concrete dust and plaster filled the tiny room. As the powder settled, Kale stepped through the ruined frame. A vicious, arrogant smirk twisted the tyrannical alpha's face. "There you are, little brother." Kale kicked a piece of debris aside. 2 armed soldiers flanked the doorway, thick shoulders blocking the only exit. Tessa dug her fingernails into the back of Leo's coat. A sealed tomb. There was no maneuvering out of this. "Let the Omega and the bastard go," Kale commanded his men, his tone slick with fake mercy. "I only want my brother's head." A blatant, dirty lie. The iron ventilation grate directly above Tessa's head popped loose. A small, agile guard dropped straight out of the ceiling, landing right behind her. A heavy boot slammed into the space between her shoulder blades, driving her face first into the concrete. "Tessa!" Lucian roared. spinning backward to rip the guard off her. Kale struck. Exploiting the distracted turn, the older brother lunged across the vault and buried a silver blade straight into Lucian's side. At the same moment, rough hands seized Leo's arms, ripping the screaming child from Tessa's grip. "No, take me!" She thrashed against the boot, pinning her spine, clawing her bleeding fingers across the rough stone floor. Lucian hit the concrete, clutching the silver hilt protruding from his ribs. Kyle stepped over his bleeding brother and turned toward the screaming child. Drawing a small glass vial filled with glowing blue liquid from his coat, Kale tipped the deadly poison toward Leo's trembling lips. The slaughter had officially begun. Rotting meat and copper choked the vault. Kale's leather shoe pinned Leo's shoulder to the concrete. Tessa tore her vocal cords, screaming, a raw, jagged sound tearing out of her throat. She thrashed against the dirt, ripping her fingernails on the grout. Above her, the soldier drove his knee harder into her lower spine, pinning her flat against the floorboards. "Swallow it, little bastard," KL hissed. Glass clicked against tiny teeth. Leo gagged. His small chest heaved, and he swallowed the glowing blue liquid. Tessa stopped fighting. Plaster dust drifted down from the shattered doorframe. Adjusting his tailored cuffs, Kyle crouched down. A silver ring glinted on his index finger, a twisted band identical to the one Tessa's mother wore the night she vanished. The metallic flash burned into Tessa's retinas, but a rattling cough from the dirt violently dragged her focus back. Kyle stood up, tossing the coughing boy onto the floor. Adrenaline hijacked her nervous system. Tessa twisted, driving her elbow upward into the distracted guard's throat. She scrambled over the broken glass, snatching Leo up and crushing his convulsing body against her collarbone. Wiping his fingers on his lapel, Kale withdrew a second glass vial. "Wolfsbane-laced strychnine," the tyrant announced. "Lethal in exactly 2 hours." A ruined roar shook the brick walls. Lucian ripped the silver blade from his own ribs. Black blood sprayed the concrete. He lunged, a blur of lethal muscle and dark hair. Kale stepped smoothly backward into the shadow of the open ventilation shaft. He held the second vial out over the dark drop. "Ah, ah, ah," Kale smiled, cold and sharp. "If you kill me, the antidote shatters, and the secret heir dies choking on his own blood." Stepping backward, the tyrant melted completely into the dark. Shadows swallowed Kale entirely, leaving nothing but the echo of his taunt. Silence rushed back into the vault, broken only by a wet, rattling wheeze. Tessa clutched her son. Frostbite memories scraped against her skull, a stray dog dying in the winter snow, shivering in her tiny arms. Leo vibrated with the exact same violent tremors. She rocked him, pressing her dirty cheek against his sweating forehead. His skin was turning the color of wet ash. "Stay with me, baby," she pleaded. Tears cut through the grime on her face. "Please don't close your eyes." A wet thud hit the concrete. Lucian crashed to his knees beside them. He clamped a trembling hand over his torn side, dark blood seeping through his fingers. The nightshade coating the blade was actively attacking his healing factor. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The lethal predator vanished, leaving a gasping, bleeding man staring at the floor. Static popped overhead. The emergency lights buzzed loudly. "I am a merciful king." Kale's slick voice distorted through the rusted intercom speaker. "Surrender your alpha status, Lucian. Leave this territory forever, and I will leave the antidote at the border for the maid." The mechanical crackle faded. The ultimatum hung in the toxic air. Fight, and the boy dies. Run, and the tyrant wins the throne. Tessa stared at the kneeling warlord. Lucian slowly lifted his chin. His eyes were hollowed out, scraped entirely clean of the violent fire. He opened his mouth to speak. "I yield." The whisper barely carried over the hum of the broken lights, but it hit Tessa like a physical blow. The diamond wolf was giving up. He dropped his blood-soaked hands to his sides, letting his chin fall back to his chest. "No, Tessa's voice scraped her throat. Lucian, you can't. He refused to look at her. He won, he rasped, staring at the pooling blood. I'll pack my things. I'll cross the borders tonight. You just save our boy. Boiling acid replaced the ice in her veins. She remembered the dark supply closet where Kale's guards once locked her for 3 days. She hadn't cried. She had dug her way through the drywall with raw, bleeding fingernails. Submitting to a tyrant never bought freedom. It only bought a shallow grave. He is lying to you, she screamed. The sound lashed off the brick. He isn't going to leave the antidote. Once you cross the border, he will slaughter us both. Lucian slowly shook his head, completely hollowed out by grief. Tessa looked down at Leo's twitching, ashen face. Her entire life had been defined by hiding in the dark, waiting for a savior who never came. She laid her son gently onto the wool coat. Standing up, she didn't cast her eyes to the dirt. She marched directly to the defeated king. Her dirt-stained hands seized the torn collar of his shirt. Planting her boots, she shoved with every ounce of hysterical fury left in her bones. Lucian's spine slammed against the concrete wall with a wet crack. You don't get to run away this time, she snarled, pressing her face inches from his. If the Alpha wouldn't fight for them, the Omega would rip the world apart herself. Brick scraped the back of her knuckles as she pinned the bleeding warlord against the basement wall. She twisted the sticky fabric of his torn collar. Refusing to cower, she dug her boots into the dirt to leverage his dead weight. Years of swallowing abuse in the dark boiled over, ripping a feral scream out of her throat. Look at me! She shook him violently. The echo of her shout bounced off the concrete ceiling, ringing loudly before fading into the dripping of a broken pipe. His hollow eyes slowly dragged up to meet hers. He stared at her like a hallucination. The submissive Omega was dead and buried. You don't get to yield, Tessa snarled, venom lacing every syllable. You tore this pack apart to find us. You ripped men in half with your bare hands. And now you want to roll over for a coward? Lucian dragged a ragged breath into his collapsing lungs. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. He has the antidote. His voice cracked, scraped raw by grief. If I fight, our son dies. Tessa slammed her palm flat against his sternum. The sudden impact snapped his head up. She kept her bleeding hand pressed directly over his hammering heart, anchoring him to the physical room. Frostbite memories flared in her mind, a starving rabbit playing dead in the winter snow, only to be eaten alive by a starving fox. Playing dead only guaranteed a slaughter. He is going to die anyway if we trust a liar, she fired back. Squeezing his collar tighter, she locked her blazing gaze onto his defeated stare. Kale expects the Diamond Wolf to kick the front doors down. He expects a frontal assault. He doesn't expect the invisible maid. Suffocating despair began to bleed out of the room. She watched the exact second the lethal predator woke up. The dull gold in his irises ignited, flaring with violent heat. His ragged gasps smoothed out into slow, calculated intakes of air. Reaching up, his blood-stained fingers wrapped entirely over her shaking hand. What do we do? Lucian murmured. The words carried zero hesitation. It was an absolute, lethal submission to her command. Releasing his torn collar, Tessa dropped immediately to her bruised knees in the dirt. She dragged her index finger through a thick layer of dried blood. Slashing a jagged line across the concrete floor, she mapped the main corridors of the pack house. 4 grueling years of scurrying through the walls like a hunted mouse had burned a flawless, 3-dimensional blueprint into her brain. Lucian sank down right beside her. His broad shoulder brushed against hers, radiating a solid heat down her spine. He didn't interrupt. Instead of taking over, he simply watched her dirt-stained fingers with absolute quiet awe. Kale will lock himself in the old king's panic bunker, Tessa explained. Her voice came fast and sharp. It sits right beneath the grand hall. The doors are reinforced steel. A frontal assault was suicide. She drew a narrower line intersecting the bunker box. But a rusted ventilation shaft feeds directly into his ceiling. The grate is too small for an alpha. A low rumble vibrated in Lucian's chest. But it is sized perfectly for an omega. Acid churned in her empty stomach. Kyle knew the servant override codes. Her missing mother had kept a secret ledger of those exact codes hidden in the laundry room 10 years ago. The terrifying implication of her mother's disappearance burned hot in her veins, feeding the violent rage necessary to survive the next hour. Shoving the dark mystery aside, she tapped the bloody map. "I will drop into the bunker from above," Tessa ordered. "I will distract him. I will get the vial." Lucian reached down into his combat boot. Leather rasped against steel. He withdrew a serrated knife. Refusing to hand it over with hesitation, he grabbed her wrist and pressed the silver hilt firmly into her palm, folding her fingers over the grip. "You don't distract him," Lucian whispered. His golden eyes glowed with pure murder. "You make him bleed." The cold weapon settled perfectly into her grip. Wrapping Leo tightly in the wool coat, she tucked the unconscious boy into the darkest corner of the vault. The poison was already ticking. Leaving her shivering son in the shadows, Tessa pried the iron grate off the vault wall and shoved herself into the pitch-black vent. She crawled forward on her elbows, clamping the steel blade firmly between her teeth. She tasted gun oil and copper. The narrow passage scraped violently against her shoulders. Damp stone pressed in from all sides, threatening to crush her ribs. Right behind her, the diamond wolf forced his broad frame into the cramped tunnel, tracking her scent blindly. Dust coated her tongue. Years ago, being locked in the dark by cruel guards had terrified her. Tonight, she breathed the stale air and embraced the absolute blackness. The shadows were no longer a prison. They were a weapon. The metallic stench of fresh blood grew thicker as they crawled higher into the walls. Directly above her skull, an armored boot slammed into the floorboards. Tessa froze. She flattened her stomach entirely against the slime-coated metal of the shaft. Plaster dust rained down on the back of her neck, sticking to her sweating skin. In the cramped dark, a rough hand reached forward. Lucian didn't grab her ankle to pull her back. Instead, his thumb found her bruised knuckles in the pitch black, stroking the skin with quiet reverence. His burning touch anchored her racing pulse, a silent promise that he was right there, guarding her back. The boots eventually faded down the corridor. Spitting out a mouthful of dust, Tessa kept crawling. Her scraped knees slipped constantly on the slick metal. Agony burned through her thighs. But the image of Leo's gray, dying face forced her violently forward. A sliver of yellow light finally sliced through the darkness ahead. They reached the vertical drop, sitting directly over the panic bunker. Tessa crept to the edge of the rusted slats, peering down into the fortified room. KL paced across a luxurious rug. The arrogant tyrant tossed the blue vial into the air and caught it with a slick smile. He was entirely focused on the steel doors, utterly blind to the executioners hovering directly over his head. Taking the knife from her teeth, Tessa locked her grip around the hilt. The slaughter was about to begin. Stagnant air cooked the narrow metal of the ventilation shaft, baking the sweat into her skin. Tessa locked her fingers around the serrated hilt. The steel dug into her palm, providing a physical anchor against the violent shaking in her wrists. Below the rusted grate, Kale paced the luxury rug. The arrogant tyrant tossed the blue vial in the air, never once tilting his chin toward the ceiling. A low vibration hummed against the soles of her boots. Lucian pressed his broad chest into her feet, coiling his muscles for the drop. Gritting her teeth, Tessa drove the steel blade straight into the rusted brackets of the grate. Iron shrieked against stone. She threw her weight forward, ignoring the burning ache in her shoulders. The metal square plummeted, smashing into Kale's back with the wet crunch of snapping collarbones. Plaster dust hadn't even touched the floorboards before a dark blur bypassed her entirely. Lucian dropped straight down the vertical shaft. He hit the marble floor like a mortar shell. Forsaking calculated alpha strikes, the warlord fought with the blinding, brutal desperation of a father losing a child. Fists collided with bone. Silver flashed in the swirling dust. Kale's blade bit deep into Lucian's shoulder, spraying hot, black blood across the velvet chairs. The warlord didn't flinch. Seizing his brother by the throat, he lifted the tyrant off the rug and drove his skull straight down into the marble. The wet crack echoed off the concrete walls. Kale's fingers went slack. The glass vial rolled harmlessly across the rug. Dropping from the shaft, Tessa hit the bunker floor. Her knees bruised against the unforgiving stone. She dragged herself toward Kale's lifeless body, her eyes catching a silver band shining under the emergency lights. It was a twisted ring, perfectly matching her missing mother's jewelry. The mystery of the stolen servant ledger suddenly snapped into a violent, terrifying focus. Ripping the cold metal from the dead finger, she shoved the evidence deep into her uniform pocket. Lucian staggered forward. Dark crimson soaked his torn shirt, the poisoned silver actively melting his tissue. He scooped up the blue glass and shoved it directly into her sweating palms. "Go!" His voice scraped out, raw and hollow. "Save our boy!" The poison was actively ticking in her son's veins. Boots skidded against the bloody marble as Tessa sprinted out of the bunker and down the western corridor. She vaulted over fallen debris, her lungs sucking in the cold draft of the outer hallways. Sights and sounds blurred into a frantic rush of adrenaline. Reaching the lead-lined vault, she slammed her shoulder into the handle. The hinges shrieked. She stumbled into the dim room, her eyes locking onto the wool coat in the corner. Leo lay perfectly still. Ash-gray skin, blue lips. The glass vial nearly slipped from her shaking fingers as she dropped to the concrete. Popping the cork with her teeth, she tipped his chin back. She forced the glowing liquid past his teeth, stroking his cold throat to coax the swallow. Silence crushed the tiny room. The metallic tang of blood and wolfsbane hung stagnant in the air. Pressing her ear flat against his sternum, she waited for a heartbeat. Dust motes drifted in the quiet. Nothing. A sharp, rattling inhale broke the silence. Leo's chest violently jerked upward. He dragged in a ragged breath, coughing up a small bit of blue foam. As the gray pallor faded, his eyelids fluttered open, revealing a bright, undeniable gold. "Mama?" The whisper was incredibly frail, but entirely alive. Tessa collapsed over him, burying her face in his neck. The scent of his hair mixed with her own tears as she crushed him against her collarbone. Boot leather scraped against the concrete directly behind her. Tessa spun, shielding the boy. Lucian leaned heavily against the warped doorframe. Blood coated his ribs, and his skin was terrifyingly pale, but a fractured, gentle smile pulled at his mouth. The slaughter was over, but the fallout was just beginning. By dusk the next evening, bleach and pine-scented cleaners had entirely masked the copper stench of the massacre. Hundreds of anxious wolves crowded the grand hall, their murmurs bouncing off the vaulted ceilings as they waited for the coronation. Tessa pressed her back against a marble pillar near the exit. The smooth silk of her borrowed dress felt foreign against her scarred skin. She belonged in the subterranean tunnels, not beneath the glittering chandeliers. The oak doors swung inward. Conversation died instantly. Lucian strode into the hall. He wore no crown. A black shirt stretched over his freshly bandaged wounds. Resting effortlessly against his left bicep was a 4-year-old boy. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd as Leo blinked his glowing eyes at the bright lights. The secret heir was finally standing in the open. Lucian marched down the center aisle, heading straight for the gilded chair at the front of the room. He didn't even pause. The Alpha bypassed the throne entirely. Pivoting on his heel, he carved a path directly toward the shadows where Tessa stood. The pack scrambled backward, giving the lethal predator a wide berth. He stopped inches from her boots. Slowly, the warlord sank to one knee on the polished tile. Balancing his son with one arm, he reached out and wrapped his rough fingers around her trembling hand. "I reject all royal alliances," Lucian projected his voice, ensuring the sound struck every corner of the room. "My loyalty belongs only to the mother of my son." 4 years of hiding evaporated in the warm heat of his grip. She stared at the lethal executioner kneeling at her feet, then looked at the smiling boy resting against his chest. Squeezing his calloused fingers, she pulled upward. "Get up, my king." Lucian rose smoothly, pulling her forward until their mouths collided. The heat of the kiss claimed her right in front of the watching army. The invisible maid was dead, and the queen had finally arrived,